Controllers have come a very long way since the first major ones in the late 1970s. And although there's probably more game controllers than is possible to list, we'd like to take a walk through the history of game controllers now. Hi folks, it's Falcon, and today on GameRanks, the evolution of video game controllers. We're going to start back in 1977 with the Atari joystick, the main controller for the Atari 2600. Now, there were other controllers that were manufactured for it, but this is the mainline controller, and that's what we're going to try to focus on today. Officially called the Atari CX-10 joystick, this was a very simple 9-pin controller in which you had a joystick and a button. Now, it is by no means the first joystick or controller ever used, but it is the first digital controller, as the previous Apple II and IBM PC controllers were fully analog. Well, it is a far cry from the standard look of a game controller today. It is very much an establishment of a lot of the standards of a game controller. The joystick goes in 4 directions, the button does, you know, what a button does. These are conventions we still have today, albeit slightly more complex, which we will talk about when we get to more complex joysticks. In 1978, the Magnavox Odyssey was introduced, and it made a pretty significant improvement on that controller with its 8-directional joystick and single button, which was not unlike the Atari controller, however, obviously enabled more gameplay options. In 1979, the Intellivision looked to improve on these functions by adding a lot of extra stuff, putting a 12-button numeric keypad on it, 0 through 9, clear and enter, action buttons on the sides, 2 on the left for left-handed players, 2 on the right for right-handed, and a quote-unquote control disc that was actually just a 16-directional pad. This is a game controller that isn't really well liked. It looks kind of like a TV controller and a numeric keypad and a silver circle combined into one thing, and it doesn't handle a lot better than that. I've held one of these before and it's beyond awkward, but it bears mentioning on account it acknowledged the need for the ability to do more buttons, more directions, etc. In 1980, the ColecoVision basically opted to do the same thing by expanding upon what was done with that controller, making a slightly better version of kind of a bad controller. The improvements were that the joystick was a little nicer. While that does make it less odd, it doesn't make it great. It's still kind of a bad design. But it's not as if this didn't influence controllers going forward. Obviously, having more buttons and more inputs is an important thing going forward in how games became more complex. 1982's Atari 5200 controller basically more or less tries to make this into a cooler concept with a more Atari-like joystick, a slightly more rugged construction, and more buttons. But it was still kind of a weird controller, and these sort of weird controllers that were acknowledging the need to make games more complex and more interesting were also the main controllers when the entire gaming industry collapsed. The need to make games into something more, I think, functions as a bit of the manifestation of fear of the industry tanking. Some people had to know that was coming and wanted to try to make games bigger and better. Unfortunately, those controllers, while they did certainly acknowledge that need and influence later controllers in saying, hey, it's gotta be more than just a single button, it still tanked. In 1983, interestingly enough, as the video game industry was literally in shambles, Nintendo saw an opportunity. Part of taking advantage of that opportunity was designing a controller that did the things that the Intellivision and Atari controllers specifically acknowledged needed to happen, but also simplified it in a manner that was palatable and enjoyable. The result was 1983's Nintendo controller. Now, this was a controller that was seen on both the NES and the Super Famicom in Japan, but functionally they're about the same. The Japanese one had a microphone input, but that's not terribly important as it wasn't a really widely used feature. The things that are important is that instead of a joystick, a D-pad across that ostensibly allowed for 4 directions, however, was perfectly capable of handling 8 directions, as was evidenced in quite a few games, was accompanied with a select button, a start button, an A button, and a B button, giving more functionality, but not so much more that in theory you would have to learn some kind of a weird number sequence, or at least whatever was implied by the number pad joysticks of the previous years. In 1986, Sega introduced their Master System, which had a controller very similar to the Nintendo controller. However, instead of a plus, it had a square to say, oh hey, 8 directions. Coming out of that square were several lines, making sure that you knew it could be pressed in diagonal directions, which was not a feature that the NES didn't have, it just used the plus thing. They wanted to try to look better. Although the Sega controller did not have a start and select button on it. In theory, that makes the controller actually a little bit less complex than the NES controller. But in 1988, Sega Genesis, also called Mega Drive in other territories, was released with a controller that, instead of 2 buttons, had 3, which in theory allowed for a lot more combinations of movement. It also had a slightly edgier design. But perhaps one of the more influential ones on controllers today, it's kind of the first time you see that curved side along with some sort of downward sloping of any kind. It eventually got a 6-button variant that became very popular too. In 1990, when Super Nintendo came out, its controller took some design cues from the Sega Genesis controller. It was curved on the sides and sort of sloped downward itself, but it went ahead and added a few more things as well. On the controller face, it had a start select, and instead of 2 buttons as the NES had and 3 buttons as the Genesis had, it had 4 buttons, A, B, X, and Y. And on top, it added shoulder buttons, an L and an R button, that I would say is a vital addition to video game controllers that we see variations on in basically all modern controllers. In fact, the SNES controller, I would say, is the most similar to controllers now. The shape of the controller was so popular that the Gravis Gamepad, a PC controller, more or less tried to be that. It came out a year after the Super Nintendo Entertainment System in 1991, and became pretty standard for anybody who wanted to use a gamepad on the PC. Now, we're not going to go into massive detail on PC gamepads, as it's entirely a third-party game. There is no official PC controller, so I brought this up because I will mention a couple of PC controllers, however, kind of in the context of the way I've mentioned the Gravis Gamepad here. In 1994, the Sony PlayStation came out in Japan, and being its origins were a CD accessory for the Super Nintendo, it's not hard to imagine why its controller looks a lot like the Super Nintendo controller, albeit with a few differences. Instead of A, B, X, and Y, it's X, circle, square, and triangle, and instead of just 2 shoulder buttons, we get shoulder buttons and triggers. I'm thinking that Sony also probably thought about the Sega Genesis controller, the fact that it went further down kind of created its own grip. They specifically incorporated larger grips into the design of the controller, which is another vital component in modern video game controller design. The PlayStation grips essentially changed the way you held a game controller and, in my opinion, make controllers significantly more comfortable. 1994's Sega Saturn continued the evolution of the Sega game controller, actually having different controllers in the US and Japan. Not fundamentally different, but I would say that the Japanese controller, although I've never held it, looks a little bit better. Both, however, are an obvious evolution of the controller that the Sega Genesis used, with 6 buttons and the addition of shoulder buttons. Both controllers kind of functioned to have grips, but not to the extent that the PlayStation did. And in the following year, 1995, Microsoft tried to replicate, I think, kind of all of these controllers at once with the Microsoft Sidewinder gamepad. It had 6 buttons like the Saturn controller, however, it had grips that were a lot more like the PlayStation controller. It was a lot more curvy like the Super Nintendo controller, and although it really didn't make a massive splash, I owned one, and if anything, it kind of represented that to Microsoft, something was going to have to be done in the gaming space. More on that later. In 1996, the Nintendo 64 came out, which is a very interesting controller indeed. Looking at it directly, it has an M shape, a D-pad, an analog stick on the middle grip, an A button, a B button, 4 C buttons, shoulder buttons, and a Z trigger. The same year, Sega Saturn saw rising competition and realized they need to do something that was going to compete with it. They adapted their 6-button controller to a large circle with 2 grips and an analog stick. Now, the D-pad and the analog stick are reversed from how we would use them today on a gamepad, but Sega was betting people would probably not like the idea of 3 grips, that you would have to move your hand and hold it differently to use the analog stick. And I'm thinking they were probably right in the long run. However, there wasn't really a lot of games that use the analog stick on the Sega Saturn, but I think this was a contribution that was an interesting sort of view into the future, that when we combine the developments of the Nintendo 64 and the Sega Saturn analog controller, we can kind of see where things were headed. In Japan in 1997, the PlayStation DualShock controller launched.
This pisses me off. They strip table salt down to 2 minerals, call it healthy, and then wonder why.
And that's pretty much the thing that we know today as more or less a standard controller. We run with a couple of standard controllers right now, and that's one of them. The addition of 2 analog sticks to the PlayStation standard layout basically enabled any game that we play today to be played with that controller, more or less. Obviously, there are some developments that we'll have to talk about later, but most first-person shooters could be played on that controller today, if you think about it. In 1998, the Sega Dreamcast launched in Japan with a sort of advanced version of the Sega Saturn controller we had mentioned a moment ago, but I think Sony noted that the Saturn controller's accessibility of the analog stick and D-pad from one single position, and the Nintendo 64's popularity of having more or less a similar design, however with 3 grips, kind of preempted the Dreamcast's controller with their DualShock, and by that time it kind of felt outdated. It did, however, have one cool addition, the VMU unit, which was a screen on the controller, as well as a memory card. In the year 2000, not only did the world end, or at least everyone thought it was going to, but the PlayStation 2 began, and with it came the DualShock 2. It's really not a lot different. In fact, cosmetically speaking, it's near